pace yourself. The latest Earth-observing satellite from NASA is now orbiting the globe. We'll discuss a mission not only delayed by weather, but also almost canceled via politics. Welcome home. Poor weather actually became a silver lining for the crew of the third private astronaut mission to the space station. With the crew back on Earth, we'll talk about the importance of their weeks-long mission and what's ahead for Axiom Space. Congressional impact. This week, NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab in California announced 530 workers will be laid off due to budget shortfalls. How the ongoing fiscal dysfunction in Washington may hurt the country's exploration ambitions. And on deck, SpaceX and Intuitive Machines are preparing to launch a robotic lander to the moon next week. This will be the second bite at the apple for NASA's Commercial Lunar Payload Services program after Astrobotic's Peregrine lander failed to reach the moon.
We know that the CLIPS program comes with risk. It's what I would term a high-risk, high-reward program. How
NASA is viewing this mission with the hopes of a Valentine's Day launch. From the Spaceflight Now News Bureau at NASA's Kennedy Space Center, this is news from the press site.
And liftoff of Artemis 1. We rise together, back to the moon and beyond.
Copies. On board the International Space Station.
Liftoff. Go Falcon, go Dragon, go Crew 7.
This allows us to go faster and to have better technology.
When we start putting humans on that vehicle, the excitement is even going to amp up even more.
Thanks for taking the time to answer our questions. Hello, everyone. So good to be with you on this Friday afternoon. I'm Will Robinson-Smith for Spaceflight Now. We're joined behind the scenes by our team, of course, our editor, Stephen Young, and our photographer, Adam Bernstein, wearing a different hat today, running some of the technical switching for our show here, News from the Press Site. And of course, this is a live show, so we want to hear from you periodically. We'll be checking the live stream, looking for good comments or questions, either for myself or for our wonderful panel guests, which I'll be introducing in just a moment. So be sure to either, for members, throw your comments in the live chat there. Otherwise, we welcome YouTube super chats as well. It helps support what we do here at Spaceflight Now, especially with our live launch coverage. With that bit of housekeeping done, let's go ahead and bring in the panel since we have a robust conversation for today. Bill Harwood, of course, you see there in the middle of the screen, is a very storied space reporter. He's been covering the space program since 1984, starting as the Cape Canaveral bureau chief for the United Press International. He's now a space consultant for CBS News and returning to the show. Bill, welcome back. And of course, you also likely very well know our other guest, Eric Berger, on the far side there. Seasoned space reporter in his own right. He's also the senior space editor currently for Ars Technica. He has a degree in astronomy from the University of Texas, a certified meteorologist, and also an author of the book you see back there, Liftoff. And just recently, last month, he announced his next upcoming book, Reentry, focusing on the Falcon 9, the Falcon Heavy, and the Dragon spacecraft. Eric, welcome to News from the Press Site.
Hey, thanks very much, Will.
We're very glad to have you both with us as we have a lot to talk about today. And since you both obviously have a lot of experience covering the human spaceflight program, we want to get started with this. This, of course, as we can bring this video up here in just a moment, will be video of the splashdown of the SpaceX Crew Dragon Freedom that happened just earlier this morning. The crew's been docked to the space station for 18 days, made 288 orbits while on station during that time, completed nearly 40 research activities while on the orbiting outpost, as well as dozens of outreach events. And they, of course, splashed down early this morning. You see in the video here them hitting the waters just off the coast of Daytona Beach. saw from a lot of folks around the Central Florida area. And Bill, you may have heard this, the sonic boom as they were streaking across the Sunshine State for a splashdown. Want to bring you guys back in and Bill, start the conversation with you. Of course, you've covered all 3 of the private astronaut missions so far for CBS. So just want to get your take to start our chat off this afternoon about your impressions of these private astronaut missions so far and your level of success based on your reporting.
You know, it's interesting. When this all first started, I had reservations about private astronaut missions. You always wonder, you know, are these commercial crew members getting as well trained as an astronaut, you know, in terms of safety systems and things like that? Of course, that doesn't apply to the commander here, you know, Michael Lopez Alegria. He's a veteran, former NASA astronaut. He made his 6th flight just now. But the other crew members are space rookies in that sense for orbital flight. And you wonder about that sort of thing. However, having said that, after 3 of these missions, I've been very impressed that Axiom Space, their management of these missions seems extremely professional. The crews have, by all accounts, done a really good job and gotten quite a lot of research done. So, you know, I give them kudos for that. It's been impressive, and I think it's accomplishing their purpose, which is to gain experience and develop procedures that they're going to need when they operate. And I'm talking about Axiom Space here of Houston, when they build and operate their own commercial space stations. So they're definitely off to a good start.
Eric, to bring you into the conversation, of course, you're in the greater Houston area, not too far from JSC. So from your vantage point, having seen the progress of the professional astronaut class, bringing in now these predominantly rookies, as Bill was saying, what's your kind of overview of Axiom Space and their effort to build up the capacity for commercial human spaceflight?
You know, it's interesting. I live just a couple miles away, actually, from where Axiom is based. They moved into an old Fry's building, actually, here in Southeast Houston. I like the incremental approach they're taking. You know, trying to get some hands-on experience in dealing with human astronauts, and as Bill said, I think they've done it professionally. And so they're learning kind of the customer experience, which I think is very important. The commercial side of commercial space stations, because that's what Axiom ultimately wants to do, of course, is build commercial space stations. Sort of figuring out what customers are actually going to want. This is a very good way to do that. So I think it's valuable for them, but it is just really a first step in a very long journey to getting to commercial space stations. The work they're doing there. So I think it's a nice first step. I think the future of Axiom is still very much kind of uncertain in the sense that there's a long way to go to make a commercial space station viable.
Yeah, and the video you're seeing here on your screen next to Eric is some that Axiom recently published. A little bit of a sizzle reel here of inside Thales Alenia is what we're looking at right now. Before you were seeing a view inside the Axiom facilities there in the greater Houston area as they're continuing to build it up. There's music here, which is why you're not hearing any audio. So we had to drop that for copyright reasons. But before the launch of the AX-3 crew back last month, we actually had a chance to speak with the chair of Axiom Space, Cam Kafarian. So if we have that video ready, let's go to that and see what Cam had to say about the progress on their station and who's going to be operating it. We'll talk more on the other side.
We will have multiple users from different areas. I mean, definitely U.S. government, because there won't be another International Space Station in orbit, right? So we expect for them to be using our services primarily. But if you sort of add to that our current partners in the International Space Station, like European countries, Canada, Japan, others, and then we're adding to it. Like for example, now we have UAE as a customer. As you know, we took a professional astronaut from UAE for 6 months to International Space Station, Saudi Arabia. We're adding all these European countries, and we're talking to a whole series of new countries that we're adding to our list of partners that will be participating. So the list is growing, right?
So that's his overview, obviously, of the partners that they want to bring on board the AX station once it's fully operational. But to bring you fellas back in, we've seen a good bit from Axiom Space, and obviously a little behind the scenes through our various reporting. But to you first, Eric, and then we'll go to you, Bill. Do you feel like, from what we know of Axiom Station's progress so far, that they're moving fast enough to be able to have a functioning station on before the nominal deorbiting of the ISS in 2030?
I think that's really the key question, Will, on the commercial space station program, and I think the answer is still very much in the air. I've heard Axiom, like a lot of commercial space companies over the last year or two, has had some challenges fundraising. And certainly to build a private space station, you need a lot of capital. So I think they're working through challenges there. Their original module, they're not going to be a free flying station right away. They're going to build their space station basically attached to the International Space Station and then separate by 2030. The original module was supposed to launch in 2024. We're now in 2024, and I think they're probably at least a couple years away from launching that. And so, they're facing some real challenges, as I think all of the other providers are.
Yeah,
Feels like kind of how you see it as well.
Well, I was just going to jump in. I want to go back to something Eric said a few minutes ago, and that was talking about flight safety and doing this safely. And whenever you hear the phrase, "Are they moving fast enough?" that always makes me a little nervous, because moving fast when you're developing spacecraft from scratch that's not necessarily a good thing. I do think it's open-ended, as Eric said, whether they can pull this off or not in a reasonable time frame. And I think one thing to keep in mind, and this sort of applies to all commercial spaceflight, is I'm not sure the market can bear or can accept a failure. I mean, I think that it's almost always have to be successful, it seems like, because of the attention these flights get, and they've got to be. We all assume NASA's doing all these things to keep their station operating safely. We all know how that works. It's not clear to me yet, and I know the private companies are trying and want to do this, but can they achieve the same levels of flight safety as a government can? That's a big question. I mean, we joke in the space reporting business, when there's a problem, everybody jokes, yeah, well, space is hard. Everybody says that, but the thing is, it really is hard. And you're operating in an incredibly hostile environment, and they've got to make it work. They certainly have the expertise to do that. But as Eric said, to go back to that, it remains to be seen if they can pull it off.
Right. And of course, just to, buttress your point, Bill, obviously, you never want to rush through something like this. I mean, that's sort of the worst possible thing you could do when it comes to making sure humans get up to and back from space safely. Only sort of use that phraseology in the context of the ISS sort of has a tentative expiration date of 2030, and ideally they'd like to have something on orbit before we get to that deadline. So just to make that final point.
I think your question was spot on, Will, in the sense that they are racing against time in terms of there are other competitors out there. There's Voyager, there's potentially Blue Origin, there's VAST, there's SpaceX with Starship. All of these companies are, building competing systems. So they're racing to get an operational system up there before them, and they're also racing against the funding. I mean, at some point the money runs out. It's not like the government, where if it gets delayed a couple of years, they can pretty much count on continued budget appropriations. At some point, investors' patience will run out with these companies, and so it's a completely different environment. But as Bill says, the physics hasn't changed, right? It's still a harsh environment. Humans trying to keep them alive.
Yeah, Eric, it's almost the Wild West out there right now, the way all these companies are competing to do this. And it's just really going to be interesting to sit back and watch it play out. I wish them all the best. I mean, I think that a commercial space station could play a vital role once the ISS is retired, and to keep that foothold in low Earth orbit. And hopefully one or more of these companies will see through to the finish line.
I think this is unquestionably the future. But it's how soon will we get to that future where it is viable to have commercial habitation in low Earth orbit? I don't know if we're 5 years from that, or 10 years from that, or 20 years from that, or 50 years from that. As Bill said, it's going to be interesting to follow over this decade.
Well, and as we continue to push towards these future endeavors, obviously we, sort of a trite expression, but one that bears true, is not forget the lessons of the past. And want to keep in this conversation of human spaceflight, but actually pivot to some of your recent reporting, Eric, where you did an article that was headlined, "What Happens When an Astronaut in Orbit Says He's Not Coming Back," which, if you haven't read it yet, it's up on the Ars Technica website right now. You can also find a link to that in the show notes beneath this video right now. It was an interesting look at an incident that came up when, one of the principal investigators that was flying on a space shuttle mission, had a bit of an incident with, frustration concerning the lack of success with their experiment. So, Eric, can you explain a little bit more, since obviously this is your story, you know it far better than I, but what exactly happened back in 1985, and what were some of the lessons learned from that?
Yeah, so I got interested in this story because I found out that there is an option to lock the hatch on Dragon when it goes to orbit. And I was like, why is that? And it turns out that the reason is that way back in the early days of the space shuttle program, when they were flying payload specialists, there were a couple of incidents, the first of which happened in 1985 with a Chinese-American astronaut named Taylor Wang, who was responsible for this experiment called the Drop Dynamics Module. And he went to operate it, and it didn't work. And he had spent basically the better part of a decade of his life researching this, building this machine, getting the opportunity to fly in the space shuttle, and it gets to orbit, and it doesn't turn on. And he asked basically mission control for time to work on it. They told him no, he had other responsibilities, and he got really despondent and despairing, and basically told mission control, well, essentially, if I can't work on this, I'm not coming back. And what happened after that is really hard to tell, because he's 83, and I was unable to locate him for an interview. The commander of the mission has died. The flight director who was on console that night has died. I was able to talk to Fred Gregory, who was the pilot on the mission, and he said when he woke up the next morning, because it was his shift with his team to be asleep, there was duct tape on the hatch, and Wang had been asking a lot of questions about the hatch. But apparently, so something happened that night which really freaked the commander of the mission out. And after that point, it became an option for commanders of space shuttle missions to have a lock that they could put on the hatch. Basically, once they got to orbit, they could lock the hatch so no one could open it. Because the shuttle hatch opening outward into a vacuum, it was pretty easy. You did a couple steps and it opened. So it would have killed the crew almost immediately. Bill Harwood's, one of his compatriots at CBS, Scott Pelley, had a report actually in 1995 on this. Didn't name Taylor Wang or the incident, but they had a picture actually of the lock on the hatch in orbit. That's the only time that's ever been publicly seen. But it's almost no one had ever heard of this. It's looking back, it was like I went to some of my space nut friends and I said, is this news to you? And they're like, yeah, we hadn't heard of that. I went to a flight director, a friend of mine, who Bill knows, I'm sure, as well, and asked him about it. He said he'd never heard of it. And I was like, you were the flight director for 7 shuttle missions. How have you never heard of this? So it's not particularly well known, but it's kind of fascinating. I think, we were talking about the challenges of commercial spaceflight looking forward. If this could happen at least 2 times on the space shuttle, I heard it also happen on Mir, where basically someone up in orbit either got sad or had a bad reaction to medicine or something, basically was freaking out, and it's not, there's lots of things you can do to kill the crew, right? On Dragon, if you wanted to pop the parachutes in orbit, that can be done, right? So, I mean, it's something I think we really have to think about, like, as more commercial people go to space, is how are we screening and taking protective measures so that, people who have bad moments in space sort of don't do bad things.
And Bill, to bring you into the conversation here, obviously you covered the lion's share of the space shuttle program. Jumping off of many of the points that Eric just made, what was your assessment of the payload specialist program at the time, that shuttle was flying in? Do you think that the lessons that needed to be learned from that and sort of the safety measures that have been implemented are, enough as we start bringing more and more non-professional astronauts on board to currently the space station, but we've just been talking about these private space stations as well?
I did cover that mission that Eric refers to as Taylor Wang, and I certainly hadn't heard of anything like that at the time. I do remember the trouble he had with that experiment. It was clearly hugely frustrating. And in the years after that, I do remember hearing a few rumors over the years of payload specialists and concern on the parts of the commanders about their, uh, I don't want to use the wrong word here, but there was some concern among some commanders with very few details. But to get to your question, I think they do as well as they can. I think that they try to vet these people who are going to fly in space as thoroughly as possible. But it's interesting. If you remember a few years ago, a German airliner, the co-pilot locked the commander out of the cockpit and deliberately flew the plane into the side of a mountain. And it turns out he had a long history of depression. He was treated by multiple doctors, and this never came out. And so medical privacy is a factor in all this sort of thing. And you just have to hope that that NASA as well as private companies are doing what they need to do to make sure nothing like that happens. I mean, I think it's an extremely rare thing to start with, but obviously the consequences, could be extreme.
It's rare, but I mean, it's happened, like I would say like on, 1/2 or 1% of missions to space. And so it's not, it's not zero.
No, it's
I
not.
wonder, does like NASA have a veto over the Axiom Space astronauts who show up and pay their $50 or $60 million and get a ride to space? I mean, can they say, do they get a veto over these people? I mean, I don't know.
My impression from early on is they do, that the company has to run their candidates by NASA. But I don't know how much of a rubber stamp that is, or if NASA could in fact exercise veto power. I don't know. It's a good question.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, as far as I can recall, whenever they've formally announced the next AX mission as the next, private astronaut mission to the station, there's been some language in there about, Axiom Space has submitted the quartet of folks that they're gonna be, that they would like to fly. The, NASA and its ISS partners are, currently reviewing, we'll make an assessment, and, so for however deep and thorough that assessment is, it sounds like there's something in place, but would definitely be curious to learn more about what that vetting process actually is. Maybe a
If
sequel
I could
story.
jump back in just very briefly, it's really a question for Eric to see if he agrees with me about this. One of the things about commercial space flight that space reporters have certainly noticed and have to deal with is how much of it is proprietary and how little folks on the outside, like reporters or even the public, find out about those sorts of details. Eric, I mean, do you see this as an ongoing problem, or is that just the nature of commercial space flight?
It's interesting. We've gotten to the point with the Virgin Galactic flights where they don't name the people who are flying on the missions until the day of the flight, which I had a PR person from Virgin write me and say, "Hey, why aren't you covering this mission?" I was like, "Well, I don't know who's flying." I mean, it's like, but I think it's part and parcel with the commercial space. They're not under any kind of obligation to really disclose this information, and so I think it's strategic on their part of what they disclose and when they disclose. And I guess since it's their money, they have a right. I do think that when NASA's involved with the commercial cargo and commercial crew missions to the space station, the public has every right to know as much detail as possible about those. And I think NASA is kind of still finding its way, and they're pretty good about holding briefings about those. But I think, as I say, NASA's still sort of feeling its way through the commercial world as well.
And going back to, something you brought up earlier, Eric, about the proliferation possibly of commercial space stations that we'll see before the end of the decade. And I'll throw this question to the both of you. We'll start with Eric, since you brought up the stations. And you've got, Starlab that's on deck, Orbital Reef, VAST are all, vying to join Axiom Space in this venture. I guess, if you put your space policy hat on, whether it be something that would come down from, NASA or, another, government, oversight body. But what safeguards do you think should and hopefully will be in place, as these start being populated by an increasing combination of both, NASA astronauts, professional astronauts from around the world, as well as, a lot of people that are just, going to want to be space tourists. I mean, I think it's on Orbital Reef that SEE, which I'm unfortunately blanking on the acronym right now, but that's the film company that'll have its own sort of entertainment module where they'll be filming the Tom Cruise movie at some point.
I think that may be Axiom, but I'm not 100% sure. But
Oh, you know what? I think you're right. That
to your
was
point,
an Axiom
Will.
module.
To your point, Will. I mean, Bill referenced the Wild Wild West earlier about development of space stations. I think it's going to get really weird when people start flying into space, and they're going to have spent a lot of money to get up there, and they're going to want to do whatever they're going to want to do, and it's pretty hard to predict that. I was talking to Starlab officials. They had an announcement this past week, and they're going to have government astronauts and private astronauts up there at the same time on their facility. And so I don't know. It's I think it will be weird is the way I would put it. And again, sort of what safeguards could you put in place to protect all of these people doing these different things at the same time? Like if private astronauts up there and they get out a knife or something because they want to, I don't know, whittle or do something. I mean, it's people, people are messy. Life is messy. And it's just, as you democratize and bring more people up there, I guess I don't have a good answer to your question. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's a sort of broad, open-ended one that I suppose we should continue to ponder as, time goes on. Bill, any final thoughts?
No, just I echo what Eric said. There's no way to predict how this is going to play out. Rules and procedures are going to get established as these things develop, and until we start seeing them fly these stations, it's we're gonna have to wait and see how. I hate to keep saying we're gonna have to wait and see, but that's what we're gonna have to do. I don't know how I'm not sure I'd use the word weird. I'll say this: it's going to be different, no question.
I mean, the government astronauts for 30 or 40 years or 50 years have been governed by if they screw up, they don't fly again, right? So their behavior is kind of constrained. They've been trained for 3 or 4 years. Private astronauts are going to go through much less training, and my attitude would be, look, I paid all this money to come up here. I'm going to do what I want. And so it's going to be really difficult. I think it's going to be difficult for the companies to manage all that.
Yeah, well, it's definitely going to be, as you both are saying, sort of a interesting wait and see game. Just want to pause for a second and welcome, as we're coming up on a half hour into the conversation. That was very fast, 30 minutes. But if you're just joining us now live for the first time, welcome into the conversation. You're watching news from the press site currently in progress. Will Robinson-Smith with Spaceflight Now. We're joined, of course, by our wonderful panel, Bill Harwood from CBS News, Eric Berger from Ars Technica. We'll jump back in the conversation in just a moment, but just want to welcome a couple folks to channel membership briefly. Alan Zero joining at the pad leader level, and Larry Linville as well. Of course, we're powered by channel membership, so we very much appreciate you for your support. And channel membership comes with a number of perks, which we talk about all the time in our live launch coverages. So we'll sort of toss to that, and you can check that out later. Obviously, we have a lot of launches coming up in the near future, so many chances to be back with us. We'll want to go to our next topic of conversation, since time is continuing to march on, waits for nobody. Obviously, one of the big stories of the week was the launch of NASA's PACE mission. PACE stands for Plankton, Aerosol, Cloud, Ocean Ecosystem. They kind of squeezed an extra word there on that one. But it was the 8th SpaceX mission under NASA's Launch Payload Services program based at NASA's Kennedy Space Center. The 12th time that SpaceX has launched a polar orbit mission from the Cape since 2020. And it is now in orbit in a sun-synchronous polar orbit, as I just mentioned. So bringing us back to the panel part of the conversation, Eric, you're a colleague at Ars Technica, Stephen Clark, a Spaceflight Now alumnus, sort of took the principal part of covering this. But as I mentioned at the top of the show, you're a meteorologist in your own right, and someone who I'm sure has their ear to the ground when it comes to things impacting climate change and the study therein. So wanted to get your overall thoughts on both the launch, which finally made it through some bad weather that we had down here in Florida, and what you think the impacts of PACE may be now that it's on orbit.
Well, I think PACE was an enormously important satellite to monitor the health of our oceans, and so I'm super excited to finally get it to see fly. It was there were many attempts to cancel it because it was pretty expensive, but also because it was going to probably tell a pretty unhappy story about climate change and sort of further provide more evidence that humans are changing the planet in pretty dangerous ways. But it was, we are kind of living in this regime right now where the Falcon 9 is the only rocket that can launch these missions for NASA because all of the Atlases are sold. And so basically for the last couple of years, including when Pace was bid, it has been SpaceX, bidding against itself for these launch contracts with the Launch Services Program. That's probably going to change pretty soon now that Vulcan has flown. But we're going to see a lot of missions on Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy over the next couple of years because, those contracts have already been let.
Well, and before you jump in, Bill, I did have another sort of follow-up to you, Eric, staying in the realm of SpaceX and its launch ambitions. As you well know, and our audience may know as well, they put a stated goal out of launching, on average, 12 times per month for the year, trying to get to 144 when all is said and done, maybe even 150, I believe is what Elon Musk is hoping for ambitiously. Given that we've seen weather play a bit of a spoiler both on the West and East Coast this week, and, impacts of a changing climate will continue to make, storms stronger and, more difficult to fly through. Obviously not asking you to look necessarily into a crystal ball, but do you think, given the realities of the world we live in, that 12 on average per month is realistic this year?
I think it's like a lot of goals, SpaceX goals, it's aspirational. They had a goal of 100 this past year, and they got, more than 90% of the way there. So whether it's 130 or 140 or 150, I don't think it really matters. I mean, the fact is that they've reached an astonishing cadence with the Falcon 9 rocket. You go back a decade and there weren't 100 launches around the globe in a single year. And now this single family of rockets, particularly the Falcon 9, is doing it, and some of these cores have flown 17, 18, 19 times. The fact of the matter is that they set out with a goal with the Falcon 9 a decade ago to try to approach airline-like operations with the vehicle. And our rockets are very different from airplanes, but they are flying machines. And the fact that they're flying off the pad at Slick 40 in Florida every week or faster is remarkable. When you think about all of the damage that happens nearby when the rocket lifts off, you got to worry about the launch tower, the umbilicals, all that stuff that's falling away from the rocket as it takes off. There's the rockets and we're using them, but there's the ground systems too, and all of the paperwork and I mean, Bill can probably attest to this, but like a launch at Florida used to be a huge event. Like the range would get set up days in advance, and then it would all get locked in, and like you would get your one launch a month from the Cape, and now they're out there launching every 3 days. I mean, it's really, the transformation we've seen there is really remarkable.
Yeah, if I could jump in, you're absolutely right about that. I mean, I remember writing stories about how the Eastern Range was, next year we're going to get where we can launch 2 rockets within 48 hours of each other, and then it was within 24 hours of each other. Like these were major accomplishments. And now SpaceX, if they weren't, blocked by weather from time to time, they've had launches that were ready to go within a couple of hours of each other. So it is a remarkable thing. I want to jump back to Pace just very briefly. Something Eric said triggered it in my mind. Whether you believe in climate change or not, anything we can do to get actionable intelligence about what's going on is a good thing. And the Pace satellite is going to do that. It's really going to measure the very complex interrelationships between, the oceans, the land, and the atmosphere, the cloud formation, aerosols that cause all that. And I think that's just tremendously valuable. So, anything we can do to get a better idea of exactly what's going on with our environment and what sort of impacts humans are having, that is a good thing, regardless of your position politically, maybe on some of these issues. So, all applause to the Pace team, and one hopes NASA can keep launching payloads like this to expand their knowledge.
Yeah, and just to underline what Bill said, the one thing that pretty much everyone in the climate change science discussion agrees on is that the satellite data is the gold standard. Like there's very little equivocation about like sensor placement or temperature monitoring stations, all that, but everyone looks at the satellite data and agrees that that is reliable bedrock data. And so the fact that we're gonna have more of it, I totally agree, Bill.
Yeah.
Well, and you know, Bill, you lightly touched on the politics of launch for a second, and Stephen, if we can cue up this next video, number 10, want to reference a quote that you had in your article where you you know, made mention of part of a press conference that you and I were both in the room up at the KSC you know, press room, and Jeremy Wardell, who is the project scientist for PACE, was asked about, you know, the near-death experience that PACE had, you know, more than once during the prior administration. So obviously we all know it, and if you haven't read Bill's article, again, that link is also in the show notes below. But this is Jeremy Wardell on, you know, the possible killing of PACE that happened during his tenure. Let's listen.
It has been a long, strange trip, as they say. Now, we were as confident as one can be that we would find ways to persevere. So the community wanted all of this. I'm not going to dive into policy or politics, but it's been a really remarkable journey, and the support from the community, the support from the agency, the support from people like yourselves asking questions and getting involved, we've kept our morale high.
Kept it high enough to get through the launch, bringing the panel back in here. You know, Bill, obviously you included in your article just, you know, as a point of historical record on the path to PACE actually launching. But, you know, given your tracking of it, were you surprised that, you know, since the Trump administration wanted it, you know, gone to put more money towards the Moon to Mars program, that Congress came in and kept putting the funds back, and that we actually, you know, made it to this week where PACE actually got to launch?
Well, you know, I don't track the budgets of these payloads to the same level of detail as Eric probably does, but I think PACE always had strong support in the science community, and that translated over to Congress in this case, and that's just all to the good. I'm very happy all that worked out.
Absolutely. Eric, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that before we move on and segue?
I would just say, from a political standpoint, if you have a champion or two in Congress behind your mission, chances are you'll get it sort of pushed through, despite what you know, the White House says. I mean, the reality is that the White House sets policy for NASA, but Congress funds it.
Yeah.
We saw that just with the Mars Ingenuity helicopter. You know, that was a program that the NASA administration did not want, fought against for years. And John Culberson in the House of Representatives, chair of the committee over NASA's budget, kept putting in $10 or $20 million a year for the budget to keep it going, and eventually it got on Mars, on the Ingenuity rover, on the Perseverance rover, and amazed us all. Same kind of thing. If you have champions in Congress, generally you can override whatever opposition there is in the White House.
Hey, you know what? Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the helicopter. We should all take a moment to say what a cool mission that was. You know, I remember reading somewhere that, you know, being able to fly in the equivalent atmosphere that existed somewhere between 60 and 80,000 feet on Earth, that's an amazing thing. And they did a fantastic job on a shoestring budget.
And 72 times to boot.
Yeah.
This is only an hour-long program, so I can't say all the things that I want to say about Ingenuity, but I think one of I would rank it as one of the 2 or 3 most important things NASA's done this century so far. And one of the really cool things about it is it was done with commercial off-the-shelf parts. They could not fly a radiation-hardened computer, so they used a Qualcomm Snapdragon from a 2015 era smartphone. The batteries they used were from a hardware store. And somehow they survived the thermal cycles from minus 130 degrees to 70 degrees. And the thing is, as Will said, it flew 72 times over the course of nearly 3 years. It's remarkable, and it's really going to open up new pathways, I think, for mission design in terms of using commercial parts that can get more performance for less buck.
Wait till we see the drone flying in the atmosphere of Saturn's moon Titan. That'll
oh man, that Dragonfly mission, I just can't wait.
That's going to be
much.
great. And, maybe if we, or when we get humans on Mars, they'll find the spot where Ingenuity made its last flight and make that a Mars National Park. And, we can see it remotely from there in the future, or at least our kids and grandkids will.
I think they'll bring it back to the Smithsonian. That would be my guess.
Well, that would be great too. I mean, I would personally, love that because I actually get to see it in that case. So I'd be hard pressed to think that any of us will make it to Mars, but hope springs eternal.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Mars is a little far from me. I'd go to the moon, but I don't know if I'm down for a trip to Mars.
I don't know, Bill. Are you throwing up your hand to go on a Mars expedition? Given the chance?
No. That's a long way to go to land on a desert. I agree with Eric. It'd be fun to go to the moon and see an Earthrise in person, though. That'd be a fun thing to do.
Absolutely. I would also do a moon trip. Mars a bit too far. Well, we were, talking about the benefits of JPL-led programs with Perseverance and Ingenuity, and unfortunately do have a bit of a more sorrowful story, connected to JPL, as we learned this week that due to lack of fiscal year 24 budget, that NASA announced 530 employees from JPL, 8% of the workforce are being laid off. They're also letting go of 40 contractors. And, NASA pointed to lack of that appropriation from Congress, as well as no final approval on the Mars sample return mission for that fiscal year. Comes on the heels of a hiring freeze at JPL. And I don't believe we have the graphic for this, so I'll just summarize Director Lori Leshen's words, just essentially saying that, due to the lower budget and, not finding another creative solution around it, that they had to make these cuts, and that, they wanted to let people know as soon as possible that it was coming. And it's obviously not the news that any of us like to hear, and, hopefully we'll have a budget soon from Congress. And so, while we're all still learning what this exactly will mean, I'll start with you, Eric. Just what were your general thoughts on, this announcement, and what do you think it could potentially mean for JPL?
So I'll start with the fact that layoffs absolutely suck. Being in the media profession, we've all seen colleagues let go from time to time, and certainly the people in California have our empathy, I'm sure. I'm only beginning to really report this story because I think it's interesting, and I wouldn't put all of the blame on Congress. I think that there's some blame to be had at the center level, probably at headquarters as well. So I think it's a pretty complicated story, and again, I'm not sure entirely what it means. But the big picture, JPL has just come through a period where they've done an extraordinary amount of work. They've got Mars Insight, they've got Mars 2020. They're coming to the end of building Europa Clipper, which is going to launch this year. And these are really some major programs. And if you look out ahead, they've got NISAR and a couple other things, and then they've got the Mars sample return mission. But that is, I think, justifiably under review because that mission was in the process of ballooning toward becoming a $10 billion planetary mission. And as I and others have reported, I think it was the management of that mission was kind of a mess. And if you looked at the budget, it really had the potential to explode. And so if you're reassessing Mars sample return, then there is a lot less work for JPL to be doing. So I think that's some of the reason why you're seeing a bit of a cut in their workforce. But again, I think it's a complicated story. It's not the fault of the people who are being laid off, but it's the fault of people in Congress and those above them. And we'll have to see in the days and weeks ahead what it really means.
Yeah, I would add on that, just expanding a little bit on what Eric said. Last year, a review panel looked at the Mars sample return mission and said, based on their analysis, that instead of costing, what was it, Eric, 5 or 6 billion was the projected cost. They said it'd be more like 10 or 11 billion to make this happen. And I think that mission really played a huge role in these layoffs. I think that they could not keep it funded at these levels to get this thing off the ground in a reasonable amount of time. And so I think that was a big factor. Now, how they recover from that, I don't know. The other wild card in all of this is, and it's not really a wild card, but these continuing resolutions and the failure of Congress to enact budgets every year, that's becoming normal. And whenever you have continuing resolutions, the agency, NASA's funding gets frozen at the level of the last approved budget. And so when you have major projects like Mars Sample Return, Europa Clipper, that's really costs money when that happens, and it just makes it worse and worse. So that's a factor it's out of the team's control how that works. But certainly, as Eric said, the management of the Mars Sample Return mission clearly played a big role in all this. It's really a combination of these factors, kind of a perfect storm that's led to these layoffs, I think.
Yeah, and to your point, Bill, obviously when they, have to hold the funding at the previous fiscal year approval, given inflationary changes, that, effectively becomes a cut, and then you can't, potentially add new programs, plan for new funding. It's hard to maneuver,
Well,
which,
Lori Lesh
affecting,
in her note to employees made the point that, they wouldn't be able to pay these people on Mars Sample Return program because the budget was scheduled to start ramping up pretty significantly, and they weren't going to have the money to do that, under the current lack of an approved budget.
Yeah, well, and to Eric's point, obviously, this story is still very fresh, and we'll continue to watch how it evolves, see obviously what happens with, all these folks that are now finding new ventures, whether they, go elsewhere in the government or to the private sector. I've seen a lot of chatter on Twitter, or X as it's called now, as I'm sure you both have as well, of, people reaching out to, now former JPLers and saying, hey, our commercial company has jobs, come on in.
I mean, that's the only upside of this, I think, that I can see, is that JPL is obviously in just north of Los Angeles, and that is the country's undisputed hotbed of aerospace talent and jobs and opportunities. And so if you're in the aerospace industry and have marketable skills, there will be opportunities for those people.
Yeah, and given the cost of living in Southern California, my brother lives down there. I know it's not cheap, so hopefully these folks will find work soon and they'll get back on their feet. We're unfortunately very quickly running out of time, so want to go to our last story here. Or actually, before we do that, just want to briefly touch on this. We would normally go through our list of launches from around the world and talk about those, but we did spend a good bit of time talking about pace, and beyond that, there was one launch from China and actually the first launch from Russia of the year. So just briefly wanted to get the thought from the two of you, given the historical precedence of where the Russian space program has been, is it surprising, or, just do the past several years just indicate that we would naturally get to the point where, you have the United States, the US companies having launched 13 times this year, 8 from China and just once from Russia?
It's not a surprise to me. I mean, Russia's space program has been in serious decline for decades. And I think that's accelerated by the war in Ukraine, when a lot of the country's resources and budget is being thrown into that effort. And there's definitely overlap in space and rockets and missiles. And so it's just, their focus is very much on that. And China is clearly the second most capable actor in space today. So the fact that they're, nipping at the heels of the United States and launch is not a surprise either.
Ditto.
Bill, is that
I agree
basically how you see it
completely.
as well?
I'm sorry, what did you say, Will?
Oh, I was just saying, is that essentially how you see it as well? That,
Oh,
just
absolutely.
the
I
last
agree
several years have
completely.
been,
There's
indicative of where we would be now?
no question about that. Russia is not the number 2 space power. China is, without a doubt. And they're following on the heels of SpaceX, or hope to anyway, as Eric knows, with trying to get rockets that can come back to landing and be reused. They've got a very ambitious moon program laid out, and it's going to be real interesting to see if who gets there first. Whether America can get astronauts back there before the Chinese do.
Bill, it's like you're reading my mind here. Pivoting to the moon is exactly where I wanted to close out this hour with. Since next week, Intuitive Machines and SpaceX are hoping to launch their first partner mission to the moon, IM-1, the Nova Sea lander, getting ready to launch from pad 39A. And in fact, it just went through some fueling tests earlier this week. There may be another one coming up before the launch. So actually, it was sort of fortuitous you were able to be with us this week, Bill, as last time you were on the show was right before the Peregrine 1 mission, bringing you back on here before Intuitive Machines gives it the old college try. So want to go to you first, and not to ask you to stare into a crystal ball and tell us how all this is going to play out. But, in talking with, some NASA folks, specifically Dr. Nikki Fox, we did last week, she reiterated the NASA position that about a 50% success rate with these CLPS program missions, the Commercial Lunar Payload Services, that is, sorry to use the acronym, that's fine, about a 50% success rate. Do you think that that's a comfortable place to place it for NASA? And, from your vantage point, how much do you think is riding on, IM-1 being the positive side of the 50%, given that's where we'll be, at the end of that mission?
I have mixed feelings about it. I mean, this is still real money. The Peregrine lander, NASA spent more than $100 million on that. So this is not trivial stuff. And I'm not sure a 50% survival rate or success rate is supportable or sustainable long term when you're talking about that kind of money. But, the thing about this launch coming up that I can't get out of my mind, the Israelis tried a commercially built moon lander and it failed. The Japanese did that and it failed. And of course, the Peregrine lander had a problem. So this is number 4 in terms of the privately built moon lander. And the thought I can't get out of my mind is you really don't want 4 in a row. And I hope they have engineered this properly and that it's successful. But yeah, I think a couple more failures and it's going to be pretty hard to justify.
Well, and Eric, you've had the opportunity to actually go to the facilities for Intuitive Machines there in Houston and, talk to the team, see the Nova Sea lander for yourself. In your conversations with them, obviously, from, an our perspective, they, want to be, hopeful and optimistic, but what's kind of your sense of their readiness based off your conversations with them and the reporting you've done on this?
I mean, they're ready. But are they 100% confident they're going to land on the moon? No, they're not. I mean, it's a huge challenge. I think the thing is, it's not going to be 50-50 forever, right? It may take Astrobotic a couple attempts before they nail it. It may take Intuitive Machines a couple attempts before they nail it. But then, once they figure it out, then I think their success rate will approach 100%. Now. And so NASA's putting up some money up front, and the reality is I don't think they put up enough money. If NASA were to do some of these missions, they're probably closer to $500 million missions, and so, they're accepting some failure. And I think, the lack of funding and the race that we talked about much earlier about commercial space stations applies to these companies as well. CLPS is a really risky program, and for that reason, I'm glad to see NASA taking it. They're trying a new approach. To eventually open up a much lower cost pathway to the moon. Maybe it will fail. Maybe they'll lose this mission. Maybe they'll lose Viper on a commercial lander, and then that'll be game over for the commercial lunar landers. But I like that they're trying something new.
And I agree. I didn't mean to imply that I didn't think this was worth trying. I do. I'm just simply stating, as we said before, space is hard, right?
Landing on the moon. Space is hard. Landing on the moon is harder, and then Mars is hardest. So
absolutely, no. I'm really happy to see them try, and this is innovative stuff. This is a hydrogen methane powered lunar lander, and that's pretty cool. And it's right. Nobody else has done that yet, I don't think. And
they built their own deep space network to communicate it with it. I mean, it is cool stuff, and it's hard.
It is.
And I think Bill shares this sentiment. I mean, I really admire the entrepreneurs that are out there giving this a go in a challenging financial environment, trying to do really hard things to, open the door to the future.
Totally agree.
Well, and one of the exciting things about this mission in particular is similar to what we saw with SLIM, where it had the little spherical rovers that were able to be shot out and take some third-party, perspective images of the mainlander. the Eagle Cam is one of the payloads that's on board this Nova Sea lander, built actually just up the road from where we are here in Florida at Embry-Riddle University. That'll be shot out and be able to get some perspective video if obviously if the lander is able to make it to the moon. That's challenge number one. But if they are able to get there, that footage will hopefully be pretty spectacular. And
well, challenge number one is the launch. Challenge number two is Peregrine found out is navigating to the moon. Challenge number three is landing. I mean, there's lots of challenges.
The challenge on challenge on challenge, definitely. So we're hopeful, for the team. We always, push, and hope for success. But we'll, as Bill said, we'll have to wait and see. And unfortunately, we've wait and see for the entire hour, and unfortunately, we've come to the end of it, gentlemen. So it's been a real pleasure having you both. Before I let you go, though, want to have you talk in turn. We'll start with Eric and then go to Bill. First off, where can folks find your work? And then secondly, what do you have your eye on from a reporting perspective, or what are you excited about for next week on the Space Beat?
My name's Eric Berger. Great to see you, Will. Bill, it's always a pleasure. You can just find my work on Ars Technica, the website. As Will mentioned, I've written the book Liftoff about SpaceX, and have another one coming out this fall. The thing I'm most excited about is I've got a story coming out Monday, I think, on the Ingenuity helicopter, and really the backstory behind the origin of that and the very concerted efforts to kill it, and by the rover operators, by headquarters, and by other people, and sort of the tale of how it actually ended up on the rover. So I think I'm really proud of it. I think it's a great story, so I'm happy to see it out in the wild next week.
Yeah, I'm going to look forward to seeing that too, Eric. I really was a fan of the helicopter. My copy is available, a web copy anyway, is available on cbsnews.com. You can just search for the name or search for a mission, and stories will pop up. My near-term concern after Intuitive Machines' flight to the moon, we're coming up on a crew rotation of the space station. I spend a lot of time covering the International Space Station, so we've got another Crew Dragon taking 4 fresh crew members to the lab. We'll have 4 others coming down in early March. And then interestingly, the Russians are going to be launching a Soyuz with a Russian commander, a Belarus researcher, and Tracy Dyson, a NASA astronaut. The commander and the guest researcher are going to come home with Laurel O'Hara, who launched last August on another Soyuz. And then Tracy Dyson will stay in orbit with 2 cosmonauts who are there already, who are logging another full year in space. So that'll be an interesting mission to watch. And so I'm looking forward to the crew rotations and how they pull all that off.
And we were talking about this offline, Bill, but I believe this will be the first time there'll be an a majority female Soyuz flight to the space station as well.
Yeah, that's right. And it's an interesting statistical point. Yeah.
So, looking forward to a little bit of history. Definitely look forward to watching and reading both of your work, gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining us here on News from the Press site. Really appreciate it, and hope you come back soon.
Enjoyed it, Will. Nice to see you, Eric.
Nice to see you.
And want to thank our team here at Spaceflight Now for helping bring together the live stream this afternoon. Of course, our Adam Bernstein helping Stephen Young doing the technical work behind the scenes to make it all happen. Thanks to our moderators in the live chat for helping keep things kosher there. And most importantly, thanks to you for spending part of your day with us. Hope you learned something, and hope you'll be back with us next week as we have much more space news to cover here on News from the Press site. For all of us here at Spaceflight Now, I'm Will Robinson Smith. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you on the next one at Astra.